Hey everyone, welcome back to another Integrative Life Network.com. And for this one, Begin Again Institute as well, webinar, I'm here with Dr. Tom Ryan, who is the founder and executive director of Living Integrated in Kansas City. I'll put a link in the show notes for later and also in the chat for you to head to his website, livingintegrated.org. He's also the author of Ashamed No More, A Pastor's Journey Through Sex Addiction. And in addition to being in ministry and all that, could you, I know I've missed a lot, Tom, of your whole resume, but could you tell us a little bit more about us? And today we're going to be really diving into your story and your work in the world now as a result of your story, I know, but I know I missed a ton of things, but anything else that you want to add to that quick bio?
No, I think you gave it a good. I was in ministry, parish ministry for a long time, and that was my primary identity, probably oriented towards the teaching part of that, pastoral care, organizational management. I tried to catch up and do a good job. Had the privilege of planting a church in that whole trajectory, which was interesting because I'm not an actual entrepreneur, but had good people around me, and so that's a part of it. And yeah, it's an interesting but a complicated story. So
See, we have lots to talk about later on about church planning because I was telling Tom that I went to seminary as well. I've got about 30 hours of seminary training, and church planning really was my draw because being able to help create new churches, and I lived in Kansas City as well. So we'll save that talk for our one-on-ones and later on. But could you tell me too, right before I dive in and just ask you to tell your story, what does living integrated do in the world?
well, we've got two thrusts, Corey, and I'm glad you asked. Primarily, Living Integrated is developed to help people who are struggling with compulsive sexual behavior find their ways to hope and to healing by integrating healthy spiritual practices and healthy recovery practices. So that's aimed towards the individual, small groups. And then we try to assist organizations who need to understand the dynamics of sex addiction in our contemporary culture and how they can support their students or staff or faculty members, whoever it is in their organization that needs recovery.
Mm-hmm. Excellent, excellent. Well, I put the link again into the chat, and it'll be in the show notes if you're watching later. And you can head over to livingintegrated.org and learn more and donate and see what even dive in further. A lot of good content on the website. So as we were preparing, I just want to say thank you. You're willing to be open and to share your story, and that kind of really that's the lead into all the other work that you're doing now in the world. But could you just tell us, the book, the name of your book, Shamed No More, A Pastor's Journey Through Sex Addiction. One, that's why I say kudos for putting the book out there into the world and talking openly about your own recovery. But could you just share that story with us, your
Sure.
story?
Yeah, absolutely, Corey. So I grew up here in Kansas City. Grew up an only child on the northeast side, and you remember where the northeast side is then. But um, like any kid, you grow up thinking your life's normal and everybody's house is like yours, and mine wasn't that case. I grew up to have a vibrant spirituality that didn't start, well, it did start in childhood, but came into full or flower, I would say, in my late adolescence. And that spirituality never left me, but running a parallel track of my life was coping with life by using sexuality, using my sexuality. And that's a big part of the story. And so trying to figure out how did we get here? It's one of the questions. What makes this make sense? How did this person get to where they are now? In recovery, one of the healthy practices is to do your best at excavating what happened, what were the influences. And yet at the same time, there's a tension there to not do the blaming, to not offset that and say, well, it's my parents' fault, it's not mine, because you have to own your own stuff. And I have to own the myriad choices I have made that have reinforced really unhealthy behavior and have had really draconian consequences for me, for my family, for my friends, for those closest to me, and even for the church that I had the privilege of founding. So I grew up in a house, two parents, but you look back and realize that it was not a healthy environment. These were two people who were probably doing the best they could, but they had their own issues, their own burdens that they were trying to handle through life. My mother actually was diagnosed as bipolar, and she was on that lower echelon of depressive bipolar. Every now and then would spike some kind of mania, but as a kid, you don't know that. She was the dominant personality in our house. My father, though this was never diagnosed, but I think that probably if they're both gone now, but he was in some aspects of Asperger's, or he manifested certainly some of the characteristics of Asperger's. So my relationship with him was one of benign neglect. He was a kind and gentle person and just not present. And even when he was in the room, he wasn't in the room. And I don't remember significant conversations with him, ever having had a significant conversation until adulthood, when I was starting to work on my recovery. And I'd take him out to breakfast, and I'd ask him questions, and even that was like pulling yarn out of him. It was just hard to get information, and certainly no feelings. My mother, on the other hand, I grew up now looking back to it. I was the moon orbiting her Earth. I was all about her and managing her feelings. If she felt better, I felt better. And that's how we were okay. And somehow in all that, finding ways, not knowing that what I had was a profound attachment disorder, and that I was having difficulty finding secure attachment. And so I was going to all the places that you fumble towards to try and find security and identity in life. When I hit adolescence and I hit that whole idea and experience of sexuality, personal sexuality, others' sexuality, sexual arousal, sexual self-gratification. Corey, that opened up a whole new world for me. And I had two simultaneous experiences. One was a profound thrill, excitement, where for the first time I was managing the emotional landscape. I was sending myself on rocket rides. I could make myself feel a certain way, and it was positive. But then almost simultaneously, this sense of guilt and shame of, oh, I don't know, what is it? I don't know if this is okay. Didn't talk about sex in my family. We didn't talk about sex in those days in church. I went to a mainline church, a nice church, good people. And a certain spirituality really began to develop in me, a real sense of God consciousness. When I got to adolescence, got involved in the youth ministry of another church. And back in those days, it was kind of a blend of evangelicalism, fundamentalism, and charismania back then. And as you can tell, I speak several dialects of Christian spirituality now, including Roman Catholicism, because of one of my spiritual mentors, and a lot of retreats that I've been able to do. And that even in Ashamed No More, there's a chapter on a stunning experience I had in an Irish monastery much later in my recovery. Anyway, I digress. So home was chaotic and home was empty. And my predominant feelings were one of loneliness and seeking drama and learning how to perform, learning how to make an impression. Because if I could come across a certain way, then others would be okay with me, and therefore I would be okay. And a lot of us live that way, and that's not a good way to live. That doesn't help us as we get older. Those tools break down, and they certainly did for me. So when I discovered self-soothing in unhealthy ways, and particularly sex, I'm afraid one of my I had dual primary attachments. I was trying to figure out how do I, without using that language and knowing that idea, how do I derive my identity and security and comfort from God? Because I had an authentic spirituality, but I was using sexual arousal and gratification and experience and exploration as the actual way in which I was comforting and soothing myself. And so those two really were at war with each other. I met Pam after I graduated from the University of Missouri. I was going to be a high school English teacher, but some of the friends in my circle thought that I had gifts for ministry and encouraged me in that direction. And so I prayed about that. I thought about that and headed in that direction. And I was working for an organization called Young Life at the time, and I was doing some speaking, and I met Pam when I was doing a Bible study at the University of Kansas on their campus. And we dated and we got married. And you know, Corey, back then there was this idea we didn't really process sex, and certainly sex addiction wasn't a known concept, totally foreign to us. But we knew that guys kind of struggled with lust. We kind of keep it, you know, quiet. But the idea was once you found the person you were supposed to be married to, and got married and started having uh, sex, that all those lust problems would go away. And for a few months, that was the case. That really was the case. We had a, I mean, I really uh, married a great person, and
Mm-hmm.
she wasn't crazy like I was. And she came from a very different kind of a family, and I loved her family, and it was awesome. But I'm still got the same head that had formed in the same pathways. And those things, when you get distressed or bored, in my
Mm-hmm.
case, either one, or alternating, as I often did,
Mm-hmm.
uh, I didn't realize I had these neural trackways, neuronal pathways that just said, okay, we know what to do. We go back to this, and this is how we stabilize, and we'll be okay. And initially, I fought that, and I was appalled by that. And one time I did try and talk to somebody about that, and they blushed, and it wasn't their fault. It's an autonomic response, but that's all I needed because I'm OCD, is all get out, and ADD, and I pick up on cues, and they're looking a little like I'm stammering, and so I'm thinking, all right, we don't talk about this. I don't have to talk about this.
Mm-hmm.
And here's where vibrant faith um, and turned into a concept that I'll talk about later, or I'll mention later, as one of the things we need to address in the church, which is spiritual bypass, spiritual bypassing. And we don't use that term, and a lot of people don't know what that is, but we do it a lot, and particularly in some religious cultures, societies, and subcultures. And it's where you take a truth, but you misapply it. You take a truth or a
Mm-hmm.
piece of truth, and you inadvertently use it to shortcut a process of psychological growth, emotional growth,
Mm-hmm.
spiritual integration that you really need to do. If you want to use religious language, a sanctification. There's a sanctification process of being reformed or transformed or putting on the image of Christ. And there's so many different passages in the New Testament that talk about that process. And we, of course, in conservative Christianity, we talk about that. But the doing it, and particularly when you've got some kind of psychological impediment that gets in the way, habitual behavior, that
Mm-hmm.
becomes the rub. And then what do you do with that? I don't know how many guys I've talked to over the years now that got into an accountability group, quote unquote, when they were in college, and because they were all struggling with pornography. So the well-meaning, whether it's through Crew or a Pure Desire group or some other entity that now exists on campus outreaches, they got into fellows accountability groups. But the classic story would be that at first they're all relieved to be honest and open.
Yeah.
But week after week after week, if some of the members were continuing to have the exact same struggle over and over and over, so just having to report the truth
Yeah.
wasn't enough to curtail the behavior. And so shame washes in. What's the matter
Mm-hmm.
with me? One of the
Yeah.
faulty core beliefs that Dr. Patrick Carnes identified. There's something fundamentally wrong with me. I got this thing with sex. It makes me feel bad, but I can't seem to live without it. I can't tell other people about it because I can't trust others. Just reinforces that. And a lot of guys then kind of drift. And a lot of those accountability groups stop talking about how this last week went because it's too painful and they don't know what to do.
Mm-hmm.
And there are some things that they can do, but we need to equip them better and equip each other better. So back to my story, what unfolded was Pam and I married. We went off to seminary. I studied at Fuller Seminary in Pasadena, and then I did a year at Princeton Seminary in New Jersey. I took both of my degrees and a Master of Divinity and eventually a Doctor of Ministry from Fuller. So I had great theological education. I was first in the Presbyterian Church USA, and then I was in the Evangelical Presbyterian Church denomination. I was in part of two great storied denominations in our country. I'm a grateful, if recovering Presbyterian, along with everything else I'm recovering from. So that's a part of my story as well. And after seminary, we were in Lawrence for a while, and then we were in Kansas City on staff at a large church, and then had the privilege of planting a church. And we pastored that church for 19 years, a church in the suburbs of Kansas City. And that was a great experience. We did some creative ministry. I got involved with the Alpha program, the Alpha course, got to go to London and meet some of the founders of the Alpha stuff. Did a lot of creative ministry, but Corey, that whole time, I'm still struggling with myself. I'm still struggling with trying to fight these behaviors because I can't totally corral them.
Mm-hmm.
And what we've learned about sexual addiction, or as it's becoming called in some courts, compulsive sexual behavior disorder, shouldn't say courts in a legal sense, but compulsive sexual behavior disorder, is that it's progressive. If we don't deal with it, it takes us, because the way that arousal, it's a process addiction, unlike chemical addictions. It's similar, but it functions differently, more like food addictions and other behavioral addictions, process addictions like shopaholic or workaholic, those kinds of things. And so sex and food are rooted in that more primal part of the brain and the survival part of the brain. And when we get stuck there, it's really hard to come out of that. It's really hard to identify it. It's really hard to figure it out. And I was in that category. But to get the same buzz in your brain, you need more and you need different. You need more and you need different. And with sex, that's a real problem, because you can progress into lots of kinds of behaviors to get the same hit, the lust arousal hit. It's why we see now with younger folks that are growing up with, cell phones in their hands, and their eyes are on screens all the time. When they're limiting their sexual exploration to online pornography exclusively, so not meeting other people, not engaging in other behaviors, that same dynamic applies. They need more and they need different. And so the arousal template that they were born with or grew into in their early formation stages has to begin to expand, because they need more and different. That's how a kid that started off at age 8 or 10 or 12 looking at pornography 10 years later is looking at other pornography that when they first started, they might have just been freaked out by. But
Mm-hmm.
now they're seeking it out because they need a harsher jolt to get the
Mm-hmm.
same buzz. It's progressive. And I was experiencing that. This is pre-internet, but I was experiencing that same progression, needing to go somewhere, and it was scaring me.
Yeah.
So I gulped hard, and I went to a therapist that I had met, and I really was fortunate. I was blessed, because while he wasn't a certified sex addiction therapist back then, I don't think anybody was, but he read Patrick Carnes' first book, Out of the Shadows. And Patrick Carnes is really the godfather, I think. I think most people would say that is the godfather of sex addiction research. And I've had the privilege of sitting under his teaching and a certification that I did. And oh my, he is a gift. And his book, Out of the Shadows, still in print, was really a trailblazer. It was documented by a lot of cases that he'd worked through in treatment, and material that he'd garnered in his research and then in his treatment of individuals. And I started reading these pages that this therapist had me read, and I immediately felt relief. Wow, it's not just me.
Mm-hmm.
There's other people that struggle with this. Wow, there's a way through this. It was tremendous. And that started my journey of recovery. That started, and that was great. What I didn't know is that I was a lot sicker than I thought, and I needed more help than I could get in that time frame. I worked with that therapist for 3 years, and by mutual agreement, we finished. And part of that was he had me disclose to my wife, which was very painful for both of us. But he set us up really well, and I told Pam. And my wife's unusually smart and emotionally intelligent. I should say, and smart, well-read, et cetera, a wonderful person. And Pam came to the conclusion very early on. I mean, she read the book. She went to see my therapist some, and she said, to herself, if Tom wants to do his recovery and do the work, then we have a chance. If Tom doesn't want to do his work, we don't have a chance.
Mm-hmm.
Keep in mind, we had 4 little kids. And when a woman has to leave her marriage with dependents, she loses big time financially. Well, that wasn't Pam's motivation. She was willing to do the right thing, whatever it was. But she also loved me, something that still kind of puzzles me. I mean, I love it. I'm a grateful beneficiary. I'm so profoundly humbled by that. But the third thing she said was, yeah, if he does his recovery, we got a chance. If he doesn't, we don't.
Mm-hmm.
The third thing was, and his recovery is his job, not mine.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. So we sculpted a little accountability support group, and they encourage us to stay in ministry and to keep working at recovery, my recovery, and support Pam. And that worked for a few years, but I liken it to flying a plane that really needs to be landed and put in the hangar and have some major engine work done. But I was trying to get maximum mileage out of it. And really, to be honest, over the next 14 years, a lot of great things happened in ministry, and our kids were growing up, and a lot of good things were happening, but I was not solving a lot of the things I needed to solve. And it was becoming worse. My distress mode, the dashboard on my plane was all red lights flashing, and I had engines on fire, and I was losing altitude. I'd started working with a second therapist who knew more about sex addiction and was very, very helpful. And he began to say things to me like, Tom, I would send you away to treatment in a heartbeat if it were an option. But given your context, it's not an option. You'd have to leave your work and probably your ordination. And I don't know how to do this with you in ministry. And unfortunately, I clumsily solved it by an April day in 2008. I had a meeting cancel. I was just coming apart, absolutely coming apart. And I went to a place where I knew guys swapped porn and talked and told stories, and every now and then walked around in the park and did stuff. And I went out to just, quote, see what's going on. Famous last words of addicts like me. And I ended up in handcuffs and arrested and spent 26 hours in jail. And it's still a painful memory. I don't tell that lightly. I don't tell that easily. I don't tell this story easily because, Corey, I know everybody who's listening right now and anybody who will dial this up and see this webinar recording later on has their own story about sexuality. And a lot of our stories are about hope, but some of our stories are about fear. A lot of us have been hurt. A lot of us have been disappointed. A lot of us are uncertain about any future healthy sexuality we might be able to enjoy or experience, or we're averse to the whole thing. We're going anorexic. We all have stories around sex, and a lot of us have been perpetrated against. We've been hurt by people. They may have been sex addicts. They may not have been sex addicts, but we've been hurt. And so I know this isn't an easy story to hear. When I was in jail, those 26 hours, I actively plotted my own escape, the ultimate relief. Dr. Richard Schwartz is the founder of internal family systems therapy modality. And I was just listening to a podcast that he did with Tim Ferriss, a really interesting podcast. And he was talking about the ways some of our parts try to cope with life and manage them. And there's usually a scale. Or then our protectors that come along and have some ways in which they want to help protect us. And there's a scale, and the ultimate scale is suicide or suicidal ideation. And I went there that night. But I pictured the face of my 4 children and the inability to explain to them why I took the way out. And I realized I was stuck. I was just going to have to work through this. So what happened was I resigned ministry. I pled guilty to a misdemeanor. I went into intensive outpatient therapy for the next year and a half. My therapist that I've been working with sculpted a personal program that we could manage and we could afford. And I did it outpatient with him. And it involved a trauma therapy called EMDR, which not everybody's familiar with, but a lot of our webinar folks probably are, eye movement
Yep.
desensitization reprocessing. And that helped immensely, subtly, slowly, but we did a high protocol of it for over a year, every week. And it for me, it was like I'd learned to look at the world through this much of a perspective, and without understanding the dynamic or even registering, except for a couple of sessions, which there was an active pop, there was something visceral that happened.
Mm-hmm.
But most of the time, it was very, very subtle, and my perspective began to broaden. And with that broadening perspective came the ability to learn how to handle life's prompts and to get myself back into that window of balance or window of tolerance more easily. Not perfectly. It's not about perfection. It's about progress. And the upshot is that today my life's very different. My head's very different,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm able to handle life not perfectly, but much better. So wrapping up my story, and then let's go wherever it seemed like the conversation should take us.
Bet.
That therapy part was intense, and that went for a couple of years. And it was then that we began to share our story with others. It hadn't come out in the papers that I'd gotten arrested. Um, so we had the privilege of doing that work privately, handed off the church to other leadership. And a couple of years later, we began to circle back to those that had been closest to us and tell them the rest of the story. Here's why Tom left. It did come out at that point. Leadership had found out. That created some problems in the church, and that's unfortunate. And I'm really sorry because I own the framework that I created for that. I don't own the behavior of everybody else. Those were their choices. That's life in community, and that's life in
Mm-hmm.
our extended families. Some of us make good choices, and some of us are operating out of fear or other motives, and we make choices that aren't as wise or aren't as good. So there's part of that. In the telling of my story and the sharing it, one of my closest friends said to me, well, you got to write a book about this because God's really done something remarkable. And in ministry, there are so many people out there struggling with their sexuality and they can't talk to anybody about it. And that was the impetus for writing Ashamed No More. And InterVarsity published it in 2012, and it's still in print. And I'm really, really grateful for that. And I've gotten a lot of feedback over the years. It was super well reviewed at the time. I was really kind of blown away by some of the reviews on the book. Looking back, it's too long for guys to read. It's over 200 pages now, and most of the chapters are 20 pages. If I write another one, it's going to be half that size, and the chapters need to be about 9. If my audience is primarily male, and that's not to put men down, it's just our attention spans aren't what they used to be. But Ashamed No More has got a lot of references in it. It tells a lot of my story and a lot of what I'd learned to date.
Mm-hmm.
One of the great things that happened was in trying to then get the book out to other people. I met a person who has become a dear friend, and you and I know her, Dr. Sherry Young.
Mm-hmm.
And she began to say, pastors can do this certification training through the International Institute for Trauma Addiction Professionals. And you ought to do it too. And I looked at her like she just sprouted a third eye in her forehead. Now, why would I do that, Sherry? And she goes, well, because you've got an ability to teach and speak church language and therapy language and recovery language. And people need to know your story. But I think that you doing the certification would be really good. So she got me started, and I did do what they call the Pastoral Sex Addiction Professional, PSAP certification. But I did the first form of that, which is going through the same 4 modules of training that all the certified therapists go through ITAP. And that was pretty rigorous. It was pretty intimidating. I learned a lot about therapists, I'll tell you that. And I say this with the deepest affection in my heart. I'm an ordained preacher of the gospel, and I planted a church, and I'm a pastor at heart, and those things. So I understand ministry people, and there's a
Hmm.
huge diversity in ministry people, and you know, on a case by case basis, one on one, we're pretty good people to be with. Now collectively, we can get a little crazy, and I found that to my astonishment, therapists are as diverse as clergy, and just as crazy. So it might be something about the helping professions and all that, that what draws us, wounded healers and that kind of thinking. But
Hmm.
it's with profound affection that I began to learn more about the therapeutic community, and
Hmm.
I've been a beneficiary of healthy therapy. So now I'm a big fan. Um, so I did that, and then ITAP revamped the PSAP training to specifically create two modules in a different faculty designed specifically for ministry people, not to turn them into therapists, but to equip them to think about
Yeah.
sex addiction in our culture, healthy recovery practices, and do it with a spiritual lens on. And I went through that. So I've actually done the certification twice. And I want to tell anybody that watches this webinar who's in ministry, the periphery ministry, lay ministry, working with others, it would be worth it to go to ITAP's site and sign up and take the certification trainings. Just two modules now. It's rich, 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 rich training. I'm grateful for it. It will help us get to a tipping point in the church, which we sorely need to get to, because people are struggling in the pews. They're dying with the inundation of pornography and sexual temptation and opportunity and exploration. And all these things, Corey, um, are really symptomatic of other issues that we struggle with in our souls. So many of us come from well meaning families.
Hmm.
You can grow up with a healthy set of parents, but you're still a person, a human being with vulnerabilities in a shadowy world where those vulnerabilities can be exploited, sometimes inadvertently.
Hmm.
It just takes one experience to happen to a young person at the wrong time in their life to freeze them emotionally. They can have
Yeah.
great parents, they can go to a good church, but the wrong encounter that hits their vulnerability, their personal psyche in the wrong way, can lock them into something that they can't identify, they can't articulate, and they will struggle with until they finally get help. Um, so,
Well,
anyway,
you, thank you for all of that, and specifically the trauma focus too is, I know you've have worked with Dr. Michael Barta, who's founder of Begin Again Institute. I'm going to put a link here to Dr. Barta's book as well, and I put links to Dr. Ryan's book in the chat as well, so you can click there and get your full book. And I appreciate your courage to tell all of the story in this window of time. I want to make a transition here too, because on most of the things we do at IOC and BAI, webinars specifically, have focused on trauma. But your whole story adds another element, which is big, particularly where I live in Oklahoma and throughout the country, is spirituality and recovery and pairing the two. And there's a third element here in particular, which is I I can only imagine the stigma too to sex and porn addiction within potentially spiritual church settings. So I'd love to talk about that and see your thoughts as you've navigated that, because for a lot of people listening that are potentially in following a similar path that you have and in recovery, and those in our audience here who work with people that have this spirituality, their faith is a huge part of that. And I'm curious your thoughts about those two, because you have mentioned shame, for instance. And when you talked about accountability groups, I'm sharing from my own story, I thought there's also a potential for in any circle, but in faith too, is judgment. Oh, you're struggling with something way worse, or with what I'm dealing with. And so I just kind of want to get your thoughts about spirituality, recovery, and sex addiction.
yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. And you put your finger on it. There's such a struggle. And again, sex is so personal. I think it's really helpful wherever somebody's coming from on the wide spectrum of Christian spirituality, and this applies in other families of faith as well, Judaism and Islam and people who are atheistic that really are either indifferent or appalled by the idea of a divine being. I mean, the human family is a big, diverse family, but we share all our characteristics apply to all of us. Having said that, my orientation is coming from Christian spirituality. And as I said, a
Yeah.
lot of different dynamics in it, and there's a lot of different flavors to Christian spirituality. But it's helpful to all of us, wherever we're coming from, to remember that the divine being or God, however we've learned about God, study about God, think about God, is infinitely complex.
Yeah.
That's really important to remember because I
Yeah.
am forever dumbing down my approach to God and trying to make him, you know, what's the old line? You know, God made man in his image, and man's been trying to repeat the thing and return the favor ever since. So we try and make
Right.
God in our image, and he's infinitely complex. But then pair that with the idea that, and we are made in the image of God. We are complex beings. We are complex creatures.
Mhm.
In Christian thinking, we too often go to the moral aspect of sexuality, which is not invalid. Of course, there's a moral aspect. There is right and there is wrong. There is health and there is lack of health. Of course, there's a moral aspect, but it's much more complex than that. And too often we kind of reduce it to a just say no approach or just do the right thing approach, or good Christians do this and they don't do that approach. And we do that to our peril because we miss the fact that there's so many other aspects to sexuality. One of them is neurochemical, as we've talked about. Another is neuronal pathways, which is related to neurochemical behavior and patterns, habits that become self-reinforcing in our brains. I think a lot of Christians miss the concept and they're not taught the concept. And this is probably true of ministry leaders, that our brains are not exactly the same as our souls. Our souls in this life are carried primarily in our brains and how our brains work, but our brains are a different thing. They're an organ. They're a little bit independent and they can develop their own shortcuts and pathways towards handling things. And we forget that. There's attachment issues, there's behavioral habits, there's family of origin issues. And then, of course, as you said, there's trauma. And
Mhm.
trauma is when something that needed to happen didn't, or something that shouldn't have happened did. And a lot of people think of trauma in terms of rape or war or being the
Right.
victim of some horrendous crime, capital T trauma.
Yep.
But what we're learning is that little t trauma and neglect trauma is just as corrosive on the health of a human soul and just as debilitating to a person's ability to interact and integrate their lives and handle their lives in different ways. So just that's a long road to say that if Christians can learn to think in terms of the fact that God's a complex being and
Mhm.
inscrutable and hard to figure out and way beyond our comprehension, and yet we're created in that image of that being, we're going to be complex as well.
Mhm.
So our problems can be complex. Our paths to healing will be complex. It's not going to be simple. There's a way forward. It's not an easy way. Another thought, and I think this is really, really important for Christians, is to remind themselves all the time, remind each other, sexuality is actually God's gift. It's a good thing. We need to be sex positive in terms of understanding sexuality as a part of the human experience. Now, as a struggling recovery sex addict, as a Christian pastor, there were times when I shook my fist toward heaven saying, what were you thinking? What on
Mhm.
earth were you thinking? Giving us this rocket fuel.
Mhm.
I've got the brain of a of a glider jet and you a glider plane and you've given me rocket fuel. I'm crashing all over the place. Okay, it's a shadowy world. But God has given us sex as a gift. Another thing is, how do we see Jesus? Now, this is focusing specific on Christian spirituality, but do we see Jesus primarily as judge, or maybe in that legal realm? Judge, the sacrificial lamb who creates a sacrifice, substitutionary atonement, opens the pathway so that our sins are removed, and now we can approach God, the Holy One. Or do we see him as the great physician? the one who comes to be with those who are weaker or are marked by their sin or are seen as sick or as the ones that need healing.
Mm-hmm.
You go into the Old Testament and you don't hear this preached on a lot, but there's a distinct link in the prophetic writings between forgiveness and healing, being forgiven by Yahweh and being healed by Yahweh. It's almost like it's the same coin, it's the same flip. And we don't think about that all the times in spiritual circles. Another dynamic that we need to confront if we're going to make our spiritual communities healthier is that we really have a subtle and sometimes not very subtle aversion to psychotherapy or to psychology or to affairs of the mind. And we need to back up, get off our high horse a little bit. And I probably shouldn't have said that. Let's edit that out, get off our high horse, because that's me being judgy. But there I am. We need to back up just a little bit and realize that all healing is God's healing, and that God heals lots of different ways. I mean, the Lord Jesus demonstrates that for us. Sometimes he just speaks a word before he gets to a person's house and they're made whole.
Mm-hmm.
Other times he's spitting in the ground, making mud and putting it on somebody's eyes. What is that about? And then inviting them to be a part of the process. Go and wash. And then they get their sight back. What is that? Another time he just puts his hands on their eyes. But then he doesn't know if they can see. He says, what do you see? Well, I see trees. They look like people walking. So Jesus does it a second time. What's he saying there, Corey? There's a process. It doesn't always happen. And so he's just demonstrating us for us in the short realm of his 3 years, or what's recorded for us of his 3 years. He's just demonstrating there's a variety of ways in which God heals. And all of it belongs to God. Well, the same with psychotherapy. People are living longer than they used to. Life's more complex than it used to be. We need more complex tools to deal with the intricacies of how we interact with this world. And so psychotherapy and psychology and the benefits of that are important. And then finally, I think, expect brokenness and struggle.
Mm.
We need to learn in our spiritual communities to not be surprised when somebody blows up their marriage or runs off with the babysitter or the pool boy or whatever else it is, but to expect the fact that people are struggling and people in leadership are struggling. This is a part of our world, and this is a part of real life. And the healthiest spiritual communities are not the ones that are able to block out or only collect the folks that really have their act together. But the healthiest spiritual communities are the ones that understand that we're all needing a hand up every now and then. We're all needing help. And we're all in different places of being healed, of finding our way forward, of really engaging our Creator in healthy ways, engaging each other in increasingly loving ways. And that really is the ultimate path, is the path of love, loving God with everything we have and loving one another the way we want to be loved. And the more that we can do that, it means that we will have to help each other in our brokenness.
Mm.
My passion, Corey, if I'm really honest, is to help use my story and because it's public and because the book's out there, I can be much more open than somebody that's still in a pulpit somewhere, somebody still leading a Bible study or running a ministry. Although more and more folks are coming forward, but we've got to change the anticipation in our communities as a whole, because frankly, we've got a problem in Protestantism that's mirrored in Catholicism. There's really only one church, and it's called clericalism. It's called the idea that those that are in charge really are cut from a different bolt of cloth. They're a little bit above the rest of us. They're not better than us, but they're morally better than us, because we need to have moral leadership. And so people feel more comfortable if they can trust their leaders to be morally perfect or morally better. And of course, those in leadership don't mind, in some sense, the benefits of clericalism, but in other sense, pay a severe price, because then we got to hide, because they're not morally better. If I'm gifted to be a teacher, I'm gifted to be a teacher. That doesn't mean I'm gifted to be morally perfect. I don't have that. I'm going to be as broken as anybody else. And we got to learn to anticipate that in Christian leadership, and then create pathways for healing for leaders while we keep them, not throw them away and say, well, come back when you've got your act together, or don't come back at all. Just go get your act together.
You fit on a big string
That's not healthy Christianity.
Yeah, you've hit on the big strain that I've seen and been a part of is esteeming a leader above what you see perhaps in the New Testament, particularly with the Christian faith, and going they're on that other level, and oh no, this can't, you know, they're up here, we're down here, and then you get a lot of the isolation that you're talking about as well too, when we're all human and struggling with things.
Yeah.
Well, I think you've given us some great pillars about spirituality and recovery, and that conversation needs to continue for sure. And I'm so glad you're out there sharing that, sharing those messages because they're great reminders, I think, for us. Um, okay, so you know, when we talk about and we're really talking about the Christian faith, although we're talking about faith in general too, but Christian faith is, the church is a community of people there to help us. And so when we kind of think through the community aspect, what do you see there? I mean, the church was left here. Jesus said, "Here's the church. This is you're here for each other." Um, I think there's a word in that too, right? Because you've continued to in your Christian faith, as you've also helped people yourself in recovery, and then others in recovery. And what's the word there to spiritual community? You kind of mentioned some big pillars for us to think through as mindset in the church, in our faith, whether it is Christian or not, just accepting and understanding each other's. All of us have things that we're working on, the inner work. But is there a thought, an invitation about to spiritual community too? And I know the work that you do at Living Integrated is a big part of that, trying to spread this message.
Well, that's a profound question. That's a really great question. As you were posing that, the words that came to my mind were active empathy.
Mm,
Active empathy. You know, that story in the gospel where the person comes up to Jesus and says, is there something in the law of all the laws? I mean, Torah had what 600 and some laws to it, specific stipulations to it in the Jewish Torah. In the Hebrew laws, there's something that stands out. Jesus goes, yes, absolutely. You should love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind and strength. Uh, Parenthetically, for people that are getting into internal family systems, well, there's a little tip right there that there's parts in us that even Jesus was, or the Torah was identifying, and Jesus was amplifying a little bit. With every part of who you are, bring it into line with loving and knowing God and pursuing that path. And he said, in the second's like it, love your neighbor as yourself. Love your neighbor as yourself. The implication is you're actually loving yourself. Some of us really struggle with self-loathing. I did, and I still do. But Jesus, by implication, is saying, now you've got to take every part of yourself and put it in the stream of being loved and loving your creator with everything you have. And then love others in the same way. Well, that requires active empathy. It means I'm not expecting you, Corey, to have your act together. It means I'm valuing you for the person that you are. It means that I'm not expecting you to be completed. I expect you to be a person in process and on the
mm,
road. And so there's the risk in getting to know somebody in a spiritual community that I may be disappointed. They may not be the friend that I wanted them to be, or they may not behave the way I thought they should behave, or they may say something that hurts my feelings. That's life. And I may
mhm,
hurt people and they may turn away from me. So the path of forgiveness becomes so absolutely essential
mhm,
to handling life. But all that I think springs from proactive empathy
mm,
of how do I see somebody else as the gift that they really are, even with their woundedness, their brokenness still evident. Yeah. I
mhm,
think if we could get there, I mean, you and I are living in a time where we're watching, I certainly am, watching the church, however you recognize it, as um, maybe in some ways losing some of its place in our culture and society, some of its
mhm,
voice, some of its impact, some of its dimension, its footprint, dwindling numbers, dwindling sizes, dwindling congregations, dwindling amounts of money, dwindling influence. Parts of our church have gotten involved in my lifetime in the political dynamics in a new way.
mhm,
And some of that influence has waned. And some of it's been co-opted for other purposes. And the church is having trouble finding its way. And the church, to become the robust, healthy community that I think it's capable of being, that I long for it to be, has to recover its primary love of those two commandments that Jesus said. Because Jesus ends up with this thunderous summary statement. He says, these two commandments, love God with everything you have and love one another.
Mm-hmm.
Upon this hangs all the law and the prophets. Upon these two hang all the law and the prophets. I don't know if we understand what a thunderous statement that is Jesus is making.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So we have about 9 minutes left. And if you have questions for Dr. Tom Ryan, author of Shame No More, and founder, executive director of Living Integrated, please put those into the Q&A button and we'll weave those in. But I have a question for you related to our audience. With the webinars we do at Integrative Life Center and Begin Again Institute in particular, a lot of clinicians are here. So from one that both is in recovery and then helping others in recovery, what perspective, what advice might you offer for those therapists with clients come in that want spirituality, faith, huge part of their lives, dealing with an addiction like sex or porn addiction? What perspective and advice would you have for those clinicians trying to help their clients on their healing journey?
Well, that's a great question. That's a profound question. I think, well, obviously, a good clinician is going to be aware of your own issues related to spirituality, because just as we all have a different story around sex, we've got our own story or get around religion or the church or spirituality and all those kinds of things. So being a good student of yourself and aware of where your own vulnerabilities are, where your own triggers are.
Mm-hmm.
But then to the degree that you can become a healthy, curious student of your client, their spirituality. If you're not familiar with their part of the church, don't get freaked out about it. And there's some strange stuff out there. There's some not strange. It's all pedestrian. It's all belongs, and it's all part of the same thing. Get them to tell their story. Ask them active questions about their spiritual, how they see God when they first learned about God, what they think Jesus thinks. Start to learn what their nomenclature is, how they actually articulate their faith. And then I think you'll figure out ways in which you can identify, do they have the kind of faith? And I think, Corey, I'm just thinking off the top of my head here, so I could be wrong, but I think that what a therapist has got to do is figure out, okay, without me judging, I don't need to judge, but as best I can do the detective work, is this person's religious framework or spirituality the kind of spirituality that we could access, client and therapist, as a piece of agency, as a piece to help in the healing process? Or is their spirituality and religious framework something that's actually toxic to the possibility of their healing? And if it's in that second category of toxicity, that's going to be tricky. Absolutely essential that the therapist understand the toxicity of that and ask gentle questions without trying to convert them, change them, confront them, because that's going to hit all their fear buttons and they're going to get defensive and they're going to say, oh, no, this is what I was told about. Therapists are just trying to turn me into somebody else. They'll have their radar up. But if you can come alongside them and asking healthy questions and just keep asking the questions, and help them dig down to a deeper level of, so at the core of things, who is Jesus to you?
Mm-hmm.
See, it's the same dynamic that there was a great Christian preacher named Earl Palmer. He used to talk about doing Bible studies on the Princeton University campus and say, the great thing about doing a healthy Bible study is some days you let the scriptures win and some days you let the scriptures lose. You don't always have to defend it. Well, because eventually the scriptures will win. Eventually God wins. Well, I think in healthy therapy, you don't always have to win the argument. You just have to help them keep prodding and getting towards what for them really is truth, and what is brought them into your office in the first place. And I think that opens up the pathways towards them making the kinds of associations and then figuring out how to dissociate from an unhealthy faith. If they've got a relatively healthy faith, then that's important that you can leverage that then in a healthy and appropriate, therapeutically appropriate way, to become an agent. That's what both of my therapists did.
Hmm.
They didn't particularly share my exact faith, but they respected it,
Right.
and they gently asked questions of how to. Now I still needed trauma therapy. I
Right.
still, and I'm not done with my trauma. I'm exploring a couple of other options, and Dr. Bart has got me thinking
Yeah.
about something too. So that's helpful. We're never done, right?
Absolutely. Well, we're going to have to do part two to this, Dr. Ryan, because there's some questions that have come in. And I mean, just being able to lay the bedrock of your story and then your perspectives on faith and recovery, so profound. But there's one question here in the last couple of minutes that came up. There's about 5 now. So I'll share these offline with you too if we don't get to them. So, what gave you the courage to talk to a therapist in the beginning with seemingly so much at stake? That really stuck out to me too. I wanted to ask, you took a leap of faith to go to a therapist to take, you know, to to share the things that had been going on inside of you.
That's a great question. What did help me to do that? I think I was becoming so afraid of what was happening, of the progression of my addiction.
Mm,
I was seeing that I was engaging in behaviors that were really alarming to me, and I couldn't control it. I had spent years trying to control it, and it was still progressing. Now, the fact that I worked so hard at controlling it and I had faith, it did help me restrain from going all the places I might have gone. If I didn't have a moral framework, if I wasn't a pastor, if I didn't have a family, um, I might have really raced on down into behaviors and patterns that I would have disappeared into. So I think I was alarmed. I was fearful. I was just really panicking about the fact that I could not control this. And I suspect, though, that too, there was this implicit idea in my faith that there really is a God, there really is such a thing as spiritual transformation. And somewhere, and I'd met this one particular therapist, and he seemed safe to me.
mm.
And so it was an invitation to wholeness, and it was a gulp hard moment. And I guess I look back at a younger Tom, and I want to cut him some slack and go, yeah, that was a good move, son. I mean, way to be you. That was one thing you did. I've done a few. I've done so many things I'm ashamed of. I've done a few things that were good. That was one of
And two, licensed professional counselors have ethical and even legal implications to keep confidentiality too. I probably assume that too much but I mean, the license part of it, they take ethical oaths. Most of the continuing education they're required to do is around ethics and privacy and confidentiality as supreme. But thank you for sharing that part of your story too. Um, so Mark asked, can you tell us about any groups you offer? How do you feel about 12-step groups?
Yeah, I cut my teeth in 12-step groups. Big believer in 12-step groups. Um, there's five. I think there's 5 different national organizations for sex addiction recovery. they're all have different orientations to how they do define sobriety. So it's alphabet soup with the sex addiction recovery groups. But I'm a big fan. I'm a big fan of therapy. I think that it's important to find a therapist that actually has studied, gotten a certification. ITAP is not the only one out there by any means. I'm grateful for it, and I think it's probably the gold standard. But I think that bottom line is you've got to have an
Mhm,
informed therapist that really understands these dynamics. And then I think a 12-step group that's a healthy group
mhm,
is an important. You've got to have community. You've got to have others around. You can't just
mhm.
do it one-on-one, you and a therapist. You're going to have to, because you're sculpting an entirely different lifestyle.
Yeah.
And so you've got to develop that culture of support. And a good, healthy 12-step group is a great way to do it. Some people don't like 12-step groups, and so there's smart recovery. There's other avenues. There's
Mhm,
celebrate recovery groups in some of the churches. There's
mhm.
creative desire groups on campuses and in other areas. So there's lots of different support groups. That we're living in a golden age of support groups. Like anything,
That's
some
good.
are healthy, some are not so healthy.
Yeah. I've heard so many clinicians too say what works for you, you know. But the key that you continue to say is support. Where are you going to find that support that you need on your journey of healing?
Yeah.
Well, there's some questions that have come in, and I don't know if we have time for it. And I thank you for your time to one, encourage to share your story again, share the platform and what you're doing in the world, and be on this webinar. How can people find you? So if they do have a question or two, how could they find you and get a hold of you?
Sure, sure. Go to livingintegrated.org. And the way to connect with us is, or you can email me at connect@livingintegrated.org. So that's the best
Okay.
way. Connect at
Yep.
livingintegrated. That's one word, livingintegrated.org.
Okay. I put those two in the chat there for you. There are some questions that I think probably are better posed in private too, related to pastors in dealing with sex and porn addiction and those type of things. But Dr. Tom Ryan, thank you so much, author of Shame No More and founder, executive director of Living Integrated. I appreciate your time, and everybody that's logged on and listened today. You can learn more about our future webinars and conversations like this at integrativelifenetwork.com. That's where we will have these and more that we shared in the past and the ones that we're going to be booking in the future. But I can already tell Dr. Ryan, we're going to have part 2 for this.
Okay. It's a deal.
Well, thank you, sir. And thank you, everybody, for being here.
Thank you, Corey.
Sir, have a good day.